Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 290. Today's conversation hits incredibly close to home for me. We are going to be talking about power, public perception, and the hidden structures that dictate taste and legitimacy in choral music. Joining me this week is Dr. Samuel Grace, a choir director from Minnesota whose recent doctoral dissertation directly explores the theoretical models of gatekeeping in choral music. He breaks down the structural loops of how music gets created, how publishers and professional organizations decide what gets heavily marketed, and how peer conversations ultimately influence what you choose to put on your concert programs. Now, colloquially these days, we tend to use gatekeeping as a dirty word. It's almost always used as an insult. But today we're looking at it academically, as an unavoidable, necessary force that can either build up or restrict the cultural value of the music that we love. We're talking about how the algorithms, the business trade secrets, even podcasts like this one can impact the subjectivity of what is good music or good teaching practice. And the ethical weight of our programming choices are impacted by this. It's a fantastic, deeply relevant discussion for any working musician. So let's dive in and stick around all the way to the end with Samuel Grace and let us know what you think about this conversation. There's going to be lots of open to discussion and open to interpretation aspects of this episode. So head over to the Choralosopher's Facebook page or to the Substack and let us know what you think. There will be accompanying posts on both. Choir directors, music educators, show planners, you pour your heart into your music. Shouldn't your events get the same attention? That's where Ludus comes in. Sell tickets, promote your concerts, and fundraise with ease. Selling merchandise and concessions? Ludus Retail makes in-person sales effortless. Running choir camps or workshops? They have a classes feature that keeps registration simple, and when you need help, the live support team is ready to pop up with real answers from real people. The best part? It's completely free for organizations. Thousands of music programs already trust Ludus because great music deserves more than just a ticketing system. Ensemble trips can be more than just a performance. They can build community, inspire artistry, and give students a reason to stay invested. That's why I recommend Kaleidoscope Adventures. For more than 30 years, Kaleidoscope has helped student groups travel with purpose, combining performance opportunities with experiences that deepen musical understanding and create lifelong memories. They'll help you find the right destination, the right venue, and the right balance of music, education, and fun. And they manage the planning from start to finish so you can focus on your job as an educator. To explore options for your choir, visit mykatrip.com or find the link in the show notes. A big shout out goes to the producers and Inner Circle over at the Patreon page. These are folks that are really dedicated to keeping the lights on here at this show. Venture Studios, Chandler Smith, Brian Long, Michael Herron, Kyle Peterson, Steve and Kathy Kakachik, David Kowalczyk, Max Jackson, Angie Schilling, Rebecca Chalk, RJ McCracken, Michael Shimp, and Kyle Siddons. Okay. All right, everybody. I am here with Samuel Grace. Samuel is a choir director up in Minnesota, but also somebody who is interested in one of the topics that I'm interested in as a choral media person, and that is the concept of gatekeeping in choral music. And Samuel did some research on that topic, and he is here to discuss that with us. Welcome, Samuel.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate being here.
Why don't you start out by just telling everybody a little bit more about you, other than being a choir person in Minnesota? What do you do every day, and kind of what led you to that?
Yeah, so my primary title, I'm the Director of Music Ministry at St. Philip the Deacon Lutheran Church in Plymouth, Minnesota. Plymouth is a suburb of Minneapolis. And at St. Philip the Deacon, I'm responsible for 4 choirs. So I have an adult choir with about 70 members, and then 3 children's choirs, a K through 2, a 3 through 5, and a 6 through 12 ensemble. Then I oversee, I don't conduct, but I oversee handbells and just the music ministry in general, which has been a great fit for me coming out of Indiana. But I guess I kind of just stumbled into choral music in an interesting way. I mean, it was always involved in choirs throughout high school and college. But I went to a small private liberal arts school in southern Minnesota called Gustavus Adolphus College. It's about an hour west of St. Olaf. And I went there thinking I was going to study print journalism. It was just something I was interested in high school, and then sort of shifted and studied piano. I got in my head that I wanted to do vocal coaching and accompanying for a living, and spent, 4 to 6 hours a day in a practice room in a box by myself while I was doing choir and other stuff. And I had a great teacher, lacked some of the technical training to rely on piano as a reasonable career choice. And so I just kind of had like this life-changing moment. I talked to one of my choir teachers, and he just recommended, say, hey, if this is something you're interested in, consider grabbing a church job when you're finished. And I used that first job to sort of decide if this was a path I was looking for. And it turns out I really liked working with people way more than just being in the practice box all day long. So I'm sure you can relate to that feeling. And then, after that, I did a master's degree at the University of Minnesota with Kathy Romy and Matt Mahaffey. And then I founded this ensemble called Impulse after that. Helped me understand that I had a real strong interest in new music, in commissions, and sort of trying to... You probably know that there's a ton of choirs in the Twin Cities, and a real saturation of volunteer choruses of all types. And someone had recommended to me, hey, you're looking for something to do. You could start a new ensemble, but you can't just found another ensemble that with choir people that meet every week. So I really kind of took as many of the opposites that I could of any other ensemble. Like, first was, we don't meet weekly, it's project-based. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of project-based ensembles in the area. The focus was going to be on secular music, and then the focus was going to be on paid projects for singers, non-traditional spaces, and we really leaned into that for the first while. But we've since sort of morphed our mission to be really focused on creative programming and creative partnerships. The non-traditional spaces is still a priority for us. We've performed in, everywhere from planetariums to swimming pools to breweries every year, stages. Cool. Outside. Basically, we look for avenues to bring choral music where you don't really typically see it. And just lived into that for a little while, and then decided to get the DM. It's called a DM at Indiana, but it's essentially a DMA at Indiana University. And was looking around for college jobs. That was always the goal. And the market was kind of weird right after the pandemic. There wasn't a lot of movement in positions, and this just happened to open up at St. Philip the Deacon, and honestly, I've been really thankful for the job here. It's a great place with stimulating music, and I kind of find maybe you feel this way. There's sort of this unspoken or maybe spoken feeling among our colleagues that sacred music jobs are mostly considered to be side gigs.
For most people, they are.
Yeah, and I think that is true. I've kind of jumped into a full-time position that don't really exist as often. But I would say I felt really sensitive about it for a while, kind of regretful that I hadn't jumped into the path that I thought my career was headed. And I almost felt like guilty like that, or felt like I was being judged as sacred music is sort of like a less than career path. But I don't really think that anymore. I'm really thankful for the position I have. It offers me great flexibility with my 3 kids. When we moved back to Minnesota, I had a 15-month-old son who's 5 now, and then we found out we were having twin girls who are almost 2. So we got busy real fast. But
that's awesome. That's
amazing. I'm sure there's more that I could talk about, but
No, it's okay, and it's interesting because you created a segue, whether intentionally or not. Because what probably made you feel sensitive about that career path are choral gatekeepers.
Sure.
That's we're always raised with all of these ideas of what it means to be a successful choral conductor, and that list of ideas that we're presented with when we're younger musicians and students in particular is always super narrow. So, for example, in 2003, when I was graduating with my undergrad, there of course was not a whisper podcasts hadn't been invented yet. So explaining to me that I was going to make a good portion of my living doing a podcast as a choral musician that was never going to be presented to me, and it still would not be seen by most of our colleagues as a legitimate sign of success in the industry, because we have got this narrow definition. And of course that kind of leads into your research. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about where this topic came from for you? You've got a paper sitting here in front of me. It's called Assessing Cultural Value, Ethical Gatekeeping in Choral Music. Why that topic?
Yeah, I think it came about a number of different ways. I think when I was thinking about my final document, I love writing, but I wanted to pick something that I was really excited about writing about, and I didn't want to write a conductor's analysis of blank piece of music. No offense to anyone who wants to go that route. I just didn't want to focus on analysis. I was trying to find something more global, or something social I could discuss or learn a little bit more about. And I'd been studying a piece of music called, it's La Pasión según San Marcos. It's the Saint Mark Passion by Osvaldo Golijov. There's a great professional ensemble called Border Crossing here in the Twin Cities that performed that piece at Orchestra Hall. And then when I was at Indiana, I wanted to sink my teeth into it a little bit more. And I was just fascinated by this idea that in the piece, he utilizes a lot of different Latin American, Afro-Cuban styles into the context of the Passion of the Christ. And at its premiere, a lot of people were sort of off-put by it. A lot of people loved it, but a lot of people questioned, is this a piece of classical music? Like, does this count as staged classical music? And I just found that to be so interesting, that we have all this sort of subjectivity that changes public perception of a certain topic. And so, yeah, this idea of personal preferences and subjectivity from trusted sources, it seems to have this really meaningful impact on cultural relevance of music in general. And so I was really thinking about that. And, and then every time you go to a conference, it's really interesting to sort of be in the elevator or listen to people as you go around that went to an interest session or heard a performance, and the way they talk about it, whether it's like trying to advance their own position or fit in with a certain peer group, or just discuss as peers how they felt about a piece of music. There's no like particular criticism on my end. I just find it really fascinating how all these different levels of things can impact how pieces of music, how people's careers are shifted. It's like when I learned about gatekeeping, I don't think this is any secret. It's just this natural force that exists in our world. It's something that you can't change. It just exists. And maybe that's depressing, or maybe that's exciting, but I find it to be just really interesting. So I just dug my teeth into it, and turns out a lot of people, especially in the field of journalism, have written quite a bit on the subject.
Right. Yeah, now my interest in it specifically comes from just, I guess, my whole life. Even before there was a podcast, I've always been something of a choral entrepreneur, and trying to do things that my colleagues don't do, and try to go in order, in a different order through the profession than I was taught to believe was possible, and I faced a lot
hear
of
you on that.
criticism. Yeah, and I've faced a lot of criticism for it, and so it's always been an interesting thing. Like, who decides? Like, that's been my whole life. Right? Like, who gets to make this rule? And I think you, like the way you explained it just now, is probably pretty accurate, which is that nobody really decides. No one person decides, although there are some institutions and different types of organizations which you can point to, like you have in your paper, that might have certain outsized influence on the ecosystem, the economy, so to speak, of choral music, and who gets to decide who's successful, who is not. But before we get too far into that, I think we should, as always with a discussion like this, we should define the term. And you did that at the beginning of your paper too. How would you explain to a person who maybe has heard the word gatekeeping colloquially, but to kind of give them a more expansive definition of how that term maybe originated, and then how are some of the ways that it gets used now?
Yeah, certainly. Well, there are kind of two definitions in my mind. There's the more colloquial one that you just brought up. That's more of a pejorative term in our modern culture. That sort of, it's like saying you like a band and saying, oh, I really like this band, but then somebody else says, well, I've listened to that band since I was, I don't know, since 1960, and you weren't born until 1989, so you're not really a true fan because you don't really know their music. You weren't there. You didn't sit. It's sort of like this ownership and social way of saying, like, you don't have a stake in this in-group. So there's this kind of concept of barriers, and people have adopted this term gatekeeper as this pejorative sense, like, hey, don't gatekeep this music, because I can like it too. You don't get to tell me whether I do or do not like this piece of music. So gatekeepers in that sense are seen as the enemy or as a problem. The term gatekeeping was coined in the 1940s by this journalist who was just trying to understand how people make selections in a grocery store, and starting to understand that there are different channels that you go through when you're making a decision to purchase a certain food. It might be how it's advertised. It might be the transportation to the grocery store. It could be where it is on the food shelf. You make all these decisions before you make a selection or a decision, and there are people or gatekeepers who are in every step of the way that lead to any decision that you make. I think another example I give, or that I was offered, is, say I bake you an apple pie, Chris, and I bring it to your house and you hated this apple pie, but you said thank you and you never told me anything else. Well, the next time I come to your house, I'm going to assume that you love that pie. I'm going to make you another one. So unless you intervene and give me some kind of other information that you didn't like the pie, I might not change my behavior. So that's just kind of another example of what gatekeeping looks like. And of course, the journalism model is such an easy one. At least before the internet, when we relied on news sources, radio and print, and to some extent television, they relied on small networks of editors and writers who decided what made the front page of the paper, what made the headlines on the radio as you're driving in the car. They decided what the most important information for us is. And we have to have that. I mean, someone has to make that decision. But this idea is that there are people who are, for better or worse, shaping public opinion based on what we see. And these days we see a shift in that because so many more people have access to distributing information, including this platform, your podcast that I mentioned in my paper, but just even everyday uses of Twitter or X or your Facebook page or your personal website, or there are different avenues for people to share information that weren't available in the past.
Yeah. No, that's a good summary. And one of the things that frustrates me about this topic in general is that the colloquial aspect.
Okay. Say more about that.
It seems to have taken over the term. Like almost like a linguistic colonialism has occurred, where that term has been conquered by the people who want to use it as a pejorative, and that's dangerous with any term because it kind of pushes us away from taking the case by case basis. And you do a good job in the paper, I think, of listing out several case studies, so to speak, of how this term might be applied, so that a person can kind of go through and understand that the same concept might be applied in different ways. So, for example, I would argue that some gates need to get kept. Like it can't be an automatically bad thing to be a gatekeeper in the original sense. For example, the field of medicine sure ought to have some gates around it. We don't want everybody who thinks that thinks that they have healing powers being allowed or encouraged to go around and administer healing services to people, and so you have to get a license. Well, that's gatekeeping. That's gatekeeping who gets to do medicine. In music education, there are rigorous trainings that we go through to know how to teach kids to know how to do music. And there should be licensure, there should be gates, there should be a standard, a threshold of minimum musicianship at which you move into the next phase. And of course, then that always brings up the next question, which is, well, who gets to decide? And then, also people who are educated in that topic. So I think there needs to be more of a nuanced approach to it, which is why I do a podcast in general, is so we can dig into these things. things, but I kind of reject the premise at the outset that it's an automatically bad thing, and that's how it oftentimes gets used. It gets used as an insult almost. Thoughts?
It's a necessary force in our world, which is something I think I wrote.
But can be abused.
Oh, 100%. I
It
mean,
absolutely can.
it's
Yeah,
not
and so I want to
difficult
make sure.
to, that's not difficult to see.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we're in agreement there. It's necessary, can be important, but also can go the other way and be abused by bad actors. Yeah. Okay. So in the paper, wanted to highlight a couple examples. I like that you started in pop culture. You included an example about Lizzo. Why don't you tell us about that? Why was Lizzo in your paper?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, and I'm glad I reread my paper this morning so I can remember everything I read. Yeah, I brought Lizzo into the picture as like a pop culture reference because she had a TED talk that she was giving about the history of twerking, like the dance style of twerking, and how it sort of had been co-opted by white women or other non-black dancers, but with the idea that it was sort of erasing the history of black women as the creators of this dance style. And so she was just saying, I think she said something like, I'm not trying to gatekeep, I just wanted to let you know who built the damn gate.
Mm.
That enjoy this dance style, but don't diminish the history of who built this dance style, I think was what she was trying to say.
Yeah. Now that was interesting. I wanted to bring it up because to me it seems like Lizzo might agree with us about this term then, if she were sitting here, because that even in that quote I see that nuance because she's acknowledging that it would be bad to claim some kind of a concrete permanent ownership of the dance style. If she says I'm not trying to gatekeep, that implies that if people want to do this, they should do it. But let's make sure we recognize the other side of that. Is that kind of how you interpret that as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was mostly an example of how the term is being utilized in pop culture. I don't think I was trying to make a direct comparison to choral music or anything specific in that particular example, but it's more just how the term is being utilized in
Yeah.
various media.
Well, I mean, you might not have tried to make that corollary, but it's there nonetheless. I mean, that happens in choral music too.
Sure.
Who is allowed to sing an African American spiritual, for example?
Oh, yeah, no,
That
I see what you're trying to say.
You know what I mean? So that conversation does exist, and it's very similar. Where a person, a scholar, one of our colleagues, maybe who's done a lot of work studying spirituals. I've had many of them on the show, and it's like almost verbatim what they would have said, which is that like we want people to do this music, but dot dot dot. There is this procedure, and there is due diligence, and there is scholarship, and then there's acknowledgement that has to happen too. And to me, that's right there in the Lizzo quote.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you about that at all. And there are a lot of great colleagues we have in this field who discuss that exact topic. And I've read a lot of good literature there. I would say that my paper is a little less about who should perform what and more about how I had to sort of narrow it in this idea of like, how does a piece of music specifically, like repertoire, go through various channels to become culturally relevant or important in our field? How does it go from its creation to canonized music was what I was particularly interested in, and less about the performance practice of historically black music within the choral center. And I think there's been a lot of colleagues who've written a lot of great things about that, but I would say that the repertoire specifically, if you're looking for like a ton of my opinions on that, I don't think the conversations necessarily are the same thing, is what I'm trying to say.
Oh no, yeah, and I don't think your paper is about that. I'm just bringing it up because I think
Oh,
that they
okay.
are that this provides a really interesting insight into why some of these debates and these discussions within our colleague sphere, why they
Yeah.
occur because
I mean, totally
there
makes
are.
sense to me. The correlation between what you're saying makes sense. There's an ownership of this music, and performing it requires a lot of information and historical context and collaboration that you can't just have by just taking it. I would say there's more morality aspects involved in a lot of those decisions. And yeah, I guess you could paint a really important gatekeeping picture there. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. 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 No, another one I noticed in your paper was you used an example of the kind of the some of the arguments, I guess you could say, or public controversies around celebrities like Dave Chappelle and Netflix, and
Yeah.
use that as an example of almost like conversations about censorship and taking something off of the air, out of
Mhm.
public sight because it's offensive, and
Mhm.
offensive to who, and having that. So why, tell us about that inclusion in your paper.
Yeah, I found that one interesting as well. I don't know if this, I mean, it happened a few years ago, but Dave Chappelle got a lot of criticism for the way he was speaking about transgender people in his comedy, and it put a lot of people off and sort of banging on Netflix's door to consider taking it just off their platform in general. And I don't know who was completely responsible for the collective decision making on it, but based on what I had put in my paper, it seemed in many ways it's kind of the sole responsibility of the president of Netflix at the time making that decision and then backing it up. So that was an example of a single gatekeeper in this sense, making an executive decision for the entire company based on how and if this material should be available to the general public. And so I think that's just a really good example of limiting or disseminating information, and in this case, disseminating it to the entire world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, to me that one was that example is interesting because I don't know what you think. It's interesting because it also helps us highlight how this concept of gatekeeping is oftentimes attributed as only a one-way street. In other words, like it's what is a person allowed to be seen, or what does a person choose to disseminate? And oftentimes, at least colloquially, as people use the term, I oftentimes see the abdication of responsibility of the individual to gatekeep their own intake of information. In other
And I
words,
think
I
that's
don't like it.
Netflix's president's position on the matter.
Right.
Yeah,
Don't watch it.
yeah.
Like basically, if choose to not watch it, and I think that's an important part to highlight too, because anytime I think, because I do also see parallels in how choral music functions, and even in your focus on the paper, which is the repertoire. There absolutely may be a piece of music that causes a person to feel challenged or offended, or even in the example of the piece that you mentioned, where somebody says, well, this is not real classical music or whatever, their opinion might be ridiculous to you, but they also have the opportunity to just not go hear it the next time if they don't like it. And so I think in a lot of ways we might put too much credence in each other's opinions. I oftentimes feel like a lot of choral musicians in particular, we program our repertoire to please each other, rather than to get each other's approval for what we programmed, rather than what our choir needs, or whether what just lights our fire. Thoughts about that?
Well, it kind of brings up another question maybe I have for you. I was taking this really interesting course at IU called Music and Trauma. And I did this short paper about trigger warnings in classical music,
Mm.
advocating for their use as a result of the people who are in the room. And I used the example of Ted Hearn's Consent, which utilizes all these texts based on sexual violence, and thought, like, look, this music, in my opinion, should be performed, but there's all these sort of discourse in the world, in movies and in theater and now music, is, do you warn your audience about the content of what is happening in your music? Is that important? In this case, I did advocate for that, just because people who are survivors of sexual violence should have the autonomy to decide whether they want to listen to this or not. If they just happen to show up and say, hey, I wanted to go to this concert, but I didn't know this piece about sexual violence was going to be on the program, I think that's an important decision for people to make. I'm happy to go on record for that. But that made me think of that when you brought that up.
Yeah. So now is your question for me that just whether or not I agree with that or?
Oh yeah, I think it would just maybe what do you think about that? Because you brought
Hmm.
up this idea about should people just don't listen to it is one
Mm-hmm.
option, or would you want people to just make up their own decisions about those things, or is it situational when you have to tell people about what's in the music that they're about to hear? I'd be curious what you think about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, so there's some interesting research about trigger warnings also that I've come across. I don't have it at my fingertips,
Sure.
obviously, but from things that I've read the psychological research around trigger warnings is that they also cause more triggering. In other
Yeah.
words, not think of it this way. Here's a thing that might really upset you. Exhibit A. There's
Yeah.
almost like a priming of that bias that I should be upset. So that does happen. Now there are other ways in this paper that I read. There are like ways to accomplish the same thing. And so I would say here's how I would answer your question in a choral program, for example. If we do a good job in our program notes of explaining ahead of time and in our concert promotion, et cetera, of here are the types of things that we're going to be exploring. That's to me that's enough of a trigger warning. So if there's something that's going to interact with sexual violence, to take the example that you used, I wouldn't necessarily frame it as a trigger warning. I would just say here's something that we're going to be talking about. And I think that's enough, because if a person knows that they are so sensitive that they should not about that topic, that being in that environment might not be good for them, then yes, of course, then they would make that decision. But also at the same time, if you feel as the conductor very strongly that this topic needs to be dealt with, it's going to feed something in your choir, in your community, then you do it, but just don't hide it. Don't try to sneak it up on somebody, if that makes sense. I think that's kind of how I would thread that needle. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. What I was concerned about, at least just learning more about trauma, is this idea of like your amygdala firing and putting you into this fight or flight situation that is triggered by name whatever possible thing. So I guess my concern was doing sort of psychological harm to people, even though I haven't had a similar experience as them. But I can also see what you're saying about are we sort of elevating this to a sense that people need to get more anxious by seeing this word trigger warning before they even know what they're getting anxious about. I could see that being true as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's all in the artful presentation
I
of it,
think
so that
I think it's context, and I think you're right. Instead of just like big red letter warnings about trigger warning, there's I think more subtle and artful ways of alluding people to the content of your music.
yeah, yeah, that's true. Now, I want to move into another part of your paper because I think this is where we get into the real meat of this topic, at least in my opinion, for
Okay.
how it impacts our jobs, whether in sacred music or myself in public school and community choirs or whatever, is publishers and
Yep.
organizations. So
Huge.
publishers and organizations, that's how we know what music there is what gets published. Of course, the changing landscape of self-publishing and on the internet
Mhm.
is so much has changed that a lot over in my lifetime, of course. But and then of organizations like ACDA. So I'd like to dive into those two things. How would you explain kind of the role that those types of things have in your paper, and how you would explain their role in gatekeeping?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's a huge aspect to our field. Professional organizations like ACDA or Course America or NCCO or any of the teacher organizations have membership of thousands of people who are doing the exact same thing that we are doing. So the kind of programming that they offer, the kind of music that they elevate, the kinds of people who are in leadership all sends a message to the entire base of who's involved. And many of them, like ACDA, has just this long-standing partnership with J.W. Pepper, was a major retailer in the United States. And having that partnership is really convenient and great. And I'm not here to demonize either organization. I'm just simply here to indicate that they have a lot of power in public perception as partners in this. So the music that they have available and that they promote in their catalogs or on their websites, or I don't have all of the information about the inner business dealings within these organizations. I'm sure that could be really interesting if there was a journalist who is interested in digging more into that particular topic. But Do you have something maybe more specific we could chat about in that
Oh,
regard?
oh
I think
yeah.
I was really interested in the catalogs through J.W. Pepper and just how we're influenced by like who a conductor's name who's on the title, or who in the catalog is getting a little image of the octavo score, or how they're categorizing the piece, or how often a composer's name is mentioned in a specific catalog, or at ACDA of all of the choirs who perform, how many composers are getting repeat performances throughout all the. I just think they all have kind of a correlation. Like what J.W. Pepper is promoting, you might see performed a lot at an ACDA or something like that. And I think that's just kind of a natural way of showing how the gatekeeping model works and how there are still the gatekeeping idea is not so homogenized as it is in social media within gatekeeping, because there are still necessary and important players involved in deciding or telling us what the best music is at a surface
Right.
level. You know, if
Yep.
you're just sort of
Yeah.
like accepting the information as it come in, you're not questioning it. But yeah.
Don't forget, it pays to listen to this show if you are a music educator. The list of discounts and benefits for listeners just keeps growing, so your checklist for back to school means getting your sheet music at graphitepublishing.com or endeavormusicpublishing.com, sight reading materials from sightreadingfactory.com along with your student memberships every time you renew, choir folders and other classroom materials from mymusicfolders.com, and now, most recently, your subplans, your ready-made activities and assessments related to music theory can be generated for you with your 3minutetheory.com membership. All of these great vendors accept the Choralosophy discount code. When you check out, you're going to get money saved for your program that helps you take your school year farther. So make sure you hit all of those websites, and it supports this show. Keeping in mind, back to the very beginning of the episode where I tried to make the point that gatekeeping isn't always necessarily bad, even though I acknowledge that people use it that way. And so I'm just hearkening back to this, but I do think that ACDA is the biggest gatekeeper in the world. They have, for choral music, they have the most institutional power to decide not only what types of music get performed, what types of ensembles get to perform, what types of ideas and views get to be presented about and discussed. Now, of course, the they is a big part of that, which is that they are our colleagues. They are people who are volunteering oftentimes to serve on committees, etc. But in terms of impact in our daily lives and what we see as legitimate in choral music, I believe that one institution, one organization has more power to kind of have a bully pulpit, so to speak, for choral directors around the world than any other institution. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a strong argument that ACDA is at the top, if not one of the top players in the gatekeeping model of our field. I'd caution to say that they are like that that's a huge problem, or that we sort of need to demonize them for having that power. I think it's more of a recognition of that power and what do you do with it. I think that's the trickiest thing, because there's a limited amount of time at their conferences to offer performances and slots for sessions or whatever it is that they're doing, advocacy, repertoire and resource materials, how elections happen, how appointments are made. And I think they're sensitive. At least over the past 10 years, I've noticed a lot of really interesting changes that have sort of leveled the playing field. And, because it's always sort of been an organization that's really focused on supporting especially schools and colleges, not as much faith-based institutions or community ensembles. And I think they recognize that. Well, I was just noticing, because the national convention's coming back to Minneapolis again this year, and
Mm-hmm.
I have it in my calendar, but it's not the same like Wednesday through Saturday model. It's something right now. I think it was like a Sunday through Wednesday or something
Mm.
for the first time, sort of changing up. And I don't know if that was to help church musicians like myself. I'm not sure at all what the decision was made, but I guess I'm just trying to say is that, yeah, I totally agree that they're at the top of that. And I think that they're aware of their power too.
Oh yeah, this is a conversation I've had with Robin Hilger several times since she
Oh,
took
okay.
over the
Great.
executive direction when she first took over that position.
Yeah.
Trying to, and essentially the way I would parse that out, that's why I gave that little disclaimer first, which is that by acknowledging that isn't always bad,
Hmm.
what I'm doing essentially is trying to keep that perspective that you just highlighted. However,
Hmm.
there is sometimes bad. In other words, sometimes because of the way organizations like that do hold that kind of power, there is a bully pulpit that can occur sometimes when people choose to use that the volunteering to serve on ACDA becomes a way to push my pet values forward. And I want to make sure that people are doing choir the way I think that they should be doing choir, and that does happen, and that's something that people have been kind of critical of organizations like ACDA. They're just the biggest, but they're not the only one that operates that way. And so I think that to me the antidote in part anyway is for us as individuals to be able to have conversations about yes, here's the way that they present us doing it, but there are other ways. So examples that I could pull out for you as as an illustration: honor choirs, for example. They do honor choirs in the way that they do them. Of course, they're supported by fees that kids pay to audition, but they're also supported largely by our dues and our membership dues. Because, for example, if I'm going to charge a $25 audition fee for an honor choir, that's only possible if the people coming to the conference are the ones paying our fees or paying for the hotel that it's in, because you're not going to pay for all that space with $25 per kid. That's going to cost a lot more. So that's one way of doing it, and it's not a bad way of doing it necessarily, but that's one way of doing it. But then there's somebody like me who runs a community organization, and I do honor choirs a different way, where I don't have the benefit of dues, so we charge kids more. But I have had people tell me that my way of doing it is unethical because we charge kids more than the $25 that they charge at ACDA. I'm like, dude, and that those types of reactions come from that. ACDA will set the tone as normal. Another example that I would be able to give you, and then I just want to get your reaction to these examples, is of course on this show. I would also argue that what we do here is in some ways a counterbalance to that type of hegemony, so to speak, in the choral culture, which is that I don't need to run my show topics through a committee to get them approved, for example. And so it is the kind of the outside of that. But I've had a sitting ACDA board member make public calls for this show to have a gate kept around it. And that attempt was made publicly because when there are attempts to go outside of that power, the people who have that power do sometimes feel uncomfortable. So I think it's one of those things where, to me, this type of gatekeeping concept that you're writing about is so crucial, because we should know not only that it's normal and natural and you can't do anything about it. However, there is the other side, which is that we also have the opportunity to talk about the nuances that the big organizations can't tackle. Thoughts?
Question: what gate was sort of being proposed around your podcast?
Okay, so I'm not going to use names, but
Sure.
there was a person who is a very prominent leader in ACDA, still is, who went online publicly with the belief that this show is problematic, and that what the real issue is that people can just listen to it without any just recording. Somebody's knocking on my door. And the specific term that was used was we need to be able to put up guardrails around the way people talk about choral music. And so to me, I actually see a direct parallel to all the different ways in your paper that people can take gatekeeping to all kinds of extremes. Namely, that the more explicit, like the one I just described, all the way to the less explicit, which is just I have a preference and I have a little bit of institutional power, so my preference is going to set the tone. I'm choosing my repertoire for a reading session. That's a I would call light gatekeeping. And then there's all the way to like the Netflix Dave Chappelle thing, and then there's the things that have happened to me on this show. Of course, on this show, I've been doing it for 7 years, nearly every week, and there's no topics that are off limits. And so that type of conversation would never show up. This conversation would probably not even show up at an ACDA conference, because if we put it in our proposal that we were going to talk about the pros and cons of choral gatekeeping and including organizations and publishers, then I probably wouldn't put it on. And so I think this is my point, is that by including that part in your paper, I thought that was really, really important. But there are people who are sensitive about it. Thoughts?
Well, I think it's important that we hold each other accountable and that we understand who makes decisions. Almost all decisions, are based on subjectivity to some extent. There's some objectivity that we can make, but especially in terms of like music selection and things like that, I've come to the conclusion that so little of it can be objective. So much of it is subjective, just on what you enjoy about a piece of music, unless you're putting really specific parameters on what someone else has decided is good music, which is also a subjective decision. It's just putting objective parameters around it. Where am I trying to get at this? I don't know. My reaction to whoever criticized you for your podcast, I would just say is, tough. You are now utilizing a platform that exists with your voice, and you have the means to say what you want about our profession on it and get different. There's really no guardrails that can be put on you unless there's some other way to like blacklist you from publishing or not getting invited to do things. I think that's sort of like the flip side of things, is kind of creating enemies elsewhere might be tricky for you. And I think that's scary and interesting to talk about. It's hard.
It's directly related. It's directly related to your paper. I was seeing of course, this happened several years after the Daniel Elder situation, which you also wrote about.
Yeah.
And I tried to get Daniel to come on the show and talk about it. I had him on the phone talking during that time, because this show started in 2019, so I was on the air during all of that, and so I covered it without him because he wouldn't come on. And his reason in my phone call for not coming on was just that I have seen how ugly this can all get, and I'm not going to engage in it anymore. And I had told him ultimately I respect that, like I get it, but it's interesting because that example, one thing I noticed that in your paragraph or your page about that situation that you didn't include, and I'm sure it wasn't on purpose, but is that the article or the post that actually went viral in that Daniel Elder situation was not his post at all. It was a colleague, and I'm still not going to do names, but it was a colleague screenshotting the post with their own context that was added on top, which again, to me, there's a gatekeeping element right there, which is, here is how you should think about this. And that was where racial connotation was added that was not in the original post. And then people took screenshots of that and started sharing it around everywhere, which I found to be, at the time, very, very interesting, that we were so wrapped up in the social media aspect of who thinks what about what, that we weren't able to even have a conversation that was productive about that. It ended up being, I think, a really good example of gatekeeping from colleagues.
Yeah, that's why I included it.
Yeah.
I'm not on social media anymore, but I was at the time, and watching that unfold was really interesting because it also forced us to have the conversation about what is okay to say. Everyone had something different to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what is okay? And what is, and I agree. And I think, and what is the threshold at which it's okay to try to end a person's career?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think there are others who would argue saying, hey, this information harmed me and you're profiting off of all of your music. I would like to see you not profit because your values do not align with me, is is, I think, their goal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how public outcry can do that. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Again, I'm very, it's not that I'm trying to have no opinion on the matter, but academically just writing about this particular topic is trying to get an outsized view of what was going on in the context of gatekeeping. This happened, he posted this thing, as a result, this is how the public reacted. And as a result, his career was not as successful in the end, was the point that I
Right.
was trying to make.
Oh, yeah, and I recognize that. I think it's a good, important academic point to make for
Yeah.
sure. And as an example of that, and of course, my experience with it is unique, partly because there are not other shows or platforms in choral music that really do what I do, and kind of serving as a cultural critic in it to like how we oftentimes will behave towards each other in public, but also through organizations, through institutions, which is why one of the reasons I think that the paper you wrote was needed to be highlighted, because
Yeah.
I think it's a very important
Felt
thing.
like I couldn't not include it just because this was
Hmm.
just a clear example of something that was happening in our field that
Yeah, no, for sure. All right, and I've got one other area to go to, and just because we got to go to this show made it into your paper. Why? So tell us why. First of all, how do podcasts fit into the gatekeeping discussion? And it's okay, you're not going to hurt my feelings.
okay.
How do so how does that fit in? And what was the goal of including a portion on podcasts, choir podcasts in your paper?
Well, like you, when I'm thinking about this topic and I'm trying to figure out who are the players within the gatekeeping field in choral music, obviously I thought about professional organizations and I thought about publishers and retailers. But then I spent a lot of time just reflecting on what other things shape public opinion, what other things shape cultural relevance of a piece of music. And
Mm,
podcasters are a great example. They come on and they give their opinions about things. They talk to other people in the field. Who you choose to have on your podcast matters. Like if you have a really big name on your podcast, that elevates your platform because you've increased social capital by inviting somebody else with a higher level of social capital. I'll be honest that I don't listen to any really, or if at all, choral music podcasts. I I spend a lot of time with choral music otherwise, and I listen to other podcasts just to separate that part of my life. So again, no offense to your podcast or
none
anybody
taken.
else's podcast, just there's only so many hours in the day. And I just thought it was really important, so I started just researching who else is doing this right now. My buddy Lawrence does listen to a lot of external choral music content, and it wasn't hard to find your work in a Google search, a podcast search, and then learn who else is writing these things, and then just finding the metrics of how well these choral podcasts are doing is
Right.
another thought. So
Yeah.
I just thought it's not a huge part of the paper, but it just does outline that you are a player within the conversation of influencing how people are thinking about this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny because when Lawrence sent me your article or your paper, that actually was the first time that I knew that I had been mentioned in somebody's dissertation or
Sure.
whatever, and it caused me to then do a search, and apparently it's been a lot more. I've been in several people's dissertations
Oh, well, there
already.
you go.
And
Has that been in the context of something like a quote they pulled from you that you wrote? You were talking about another piece
there
of.
have been, yes, there have been those. Some people more specifically researching how podcasts are being consumed in music
Mm-hmm.
education. In what ways are they shaping classroom practices? Those types of things have been in there, and it's interesting because when earlier I mentioned that I kind of see what I do here as a. Some people have called me the Rebel Alliance of choral music because of that juxtaposition, being willing to criticize institutional issues and issues within the choral culture, of how we behave and how we communicate with each other and those types of things. But when I first saw this one, I knew I had to talk to you about it because I think that I recognize how a platform like this should be included in the conversation of what shapes opinion and gatekeeping, etc. But also on the other side of it, I do see a lot of what I do and motivation for what I do as being and attempting to be the antidote for some of that gatekeeping. Like we get to talk about the things that the big players don't want to, or acknowledge some of the issues with ACDA, or acknowledge some of the issues with publishers that are maybe keeping certain worthy types of music out of our catalogs, or those types of things. And so I think these are important topics to discuss, and I really appreciate you being willing to come on and discuss them with me.
Yeah, it's an honor. I think the trickiest thing about this situation, I had a lot of discussions with my advisor about it, is I guess I don't see myself in the same context of like this sort of rebel alliance that I'm really trying to stir things up. And you can tell that I've been a little bit careful of what I'm saying or issuing like a really strong opinion about something. And it's not necessarily that I don't have one, but I think so many of these things are so broad and so vague that it requires a lot more specific information and understanding of the entire situation before you can sort of make a blanket judgment about something. Like me discussing J.W. Pepper's catalogs in detail and like how they appear is how I am looking at it academically, but I didn't get to interview anybody in their company about how they make those decisions and who's in charge of those decisions. There's business secrets and trade secrets within professional organizations that I just don't have access to. And so in many ways, I can't speculate about a lot of what is going on. I mean, I guess I can totally speculate, but I don't think it's reasonable for me to sort of make blanket judgments. I guess I'll agree with you that there are major players in it, and I think that's undeniable, but it's kind of hard for me to look at someone and be like, oh, you have all this sort of social capital within our field and you don't deserve it. I don't know if I'll go that far. I'm more interested in like, how did you get there? Like what hoops did you jump through? What gates got you to a certain place? Because you have something that has caused you to get to this level of cultural capital. And that's about just specific people. And I wrote more about specific pieces of music. I was like, there are so many different ways I could take this paper. And by just outlining a specific piece of music, I thought was really interesting. So I know we haven't gotten to it yet, but I chose 3 very different pieces to use as sort of a case study for this. The first was the Golohoff Passion, which was a commission by Helmut Rilling and the the Bach Academy in Stuttgart, I think. They commissioned 4 new Passion settings for the year 2000, and each of those pieces has had varying levels of success. But if you're not in an in-group of choral music, you probably aren't familiar with the work. But it had and continues to have massive success and is studied frequently in choral literature courses. It's presented as an important piece of music. And then I chose Joel Thompson's 7 Last Words of the Unarmed as another piece, as something that highlighted an important social discourse about violence against Black men in our world, and a piece that was not received well and was not programmed as often until George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And how social events prompt up different pieces of music, and how that can be seen as a bad thing. It could just be like, oh, you just like this music now because of Black trauma. Or you could argue, now this is breathing life into this discourse. And then the third piece I chose was a short octavo called Oh Love by Elaine Hagenberg, which is widely programmed and widely heard at ACDA-like events, a top seller, gets tons of YouTube clicks, lots of comments. And my argument in all of this, and maybe this sounds stupid, is that in terms of subjectivity, you can't really decide which one of these 3 pieces is better. They all have important cultural capital in our field and are completely wildly different. and took very different journeys into their level of consciousness among the people who consume it. And I just find that incredibly fascinating. And I feel like you can apply that model to so many different kinds of music. Now, if you wanted to take things another direction, you could pull in a person's gatekeeping journey. You could think about your own career and the path it led you to podcasting and teaching and running your ensembles. I think about it in my own life too, going from someone who wasn't focused on choral music and then all of a sudden was, and was like, oh shoot, why didn't I study music education and take the traditional path that everybody else took? Because I realized too late that this is what I wanted to do. It's just all kind of, I guess I'm just endlessly fascinated by how we show up to where we are today. And yeah, it's amazing.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that's a really great way to summarize this. And like I said, I appreciate your time, and I could probably nerd out on this all day, but we'll wrap it up there. If it's okay, while people are still listening here, is this paper something that you're allowed or willing to share? Can I and put it in the show notes so people can read it?
Yeah, I think it's available
I
publicly
didn't.
on.
Yeah, I didn't have to pay to get at it.
Yeah, I think it's what is it? IU something. I can send you a link to it if that's
I've got
helpful.
it.
If you have one.
I've got it.
Yeah,
Lauren sent it to me.
it's public. It's in the IU library. I think most dissertations from any public institution like IU or others, they're all publicly available. It's something I wrote, and anybody can read it. And anybody's welcome to reach out and chat with me about it too. I'm
Yeah.
happy to process this idea more than once. I think it was just so funny. I think I will say that I did get into this with sort of like this vigilante, like, I'm going to change the world by outlining how all these people are in power and they're deciding all this stuff, and that makes me really upset. And then just realizing like it's also nothing that can be changed. It's a necessary force in our world, so it's more about just being ethical and responsible, understanding what kind of power you have. Each of us has different levels of power and reach, and we can all play an ethical responsibility, whatever that means to you, into making our field a better place.
Yeah, that's really well said. I couldn't agree more. And I'll again thank you for your time. This has been a blast. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one at Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.